This is Selma Schimmel in San Antonio at the annual San Antonio Breast Cancer Symposium, where we're joined by Dr. Cliff Hudis, is the Chief of Breast Cancer Medicine Service at Memorial Sloan-Kettering Cancer Center in New York City. Hello, Dr. Hudis.
Hi.
One of the things I'd love to talk to you today about are clinical trials. Vital to progress. It's the core to all research and all the good things and advances we're seeing in breast oncology. What are some of the challenges that all of you as researchers and clinicians face with clinical trials?
Those of us who you talk to here are all, one way or the other, involved in the clinical trials process. It is the science of how we take care of patients. Everything that we do in caring for patients with cancer is really predicated on and built on the results of previously conducted clinical trials. So there's a science to how we do clinical trials, and it is equally important as the laboratory science. It has to be as rigorous, it has to be quantifiable the way the laboratory science is, and we have to be able to trust it because in the end we're acting on it, we're affecting people's lives. Now, here are the problems, and they are not trivial. First, we all know, and we hear it all the time, that only 2 or 3 or maybe 4% of adults with cancer, I mean solid tumors, breast cancer, prostate cancer, lung cancer, colon cancer, the common cancers, actually participate in clinical trials. And there are important reasons for that, including the perception on the side of the patients about what it means to be in a clinical trial, but also is the sheer expense and work of conducting and running these trials and what it means for the practitioner, the sacrifices that they actually have to make personally to do this. And then there is the tremendous behind-the-scenes regulatory burden of doing clinical trials, which can be stratified. There is the level of regulatory burden just to do your clinical research, and then there's the additional burden that comes with trying to do trials that will garner a label from the FDA for a product or drug. That's the FDA standards. And I'm not starting off by complaining about any of this. I'm pointing out that what you see when somebody presents a clinical trial at a meeting like this is the bare tip of the iceberg of work. Sometimes at the end of a talk, you'll see a slide with literally 100 names on it of collaborators for the study. Even that doesn't begin to explain the amount of effort. Now, here's the problem. For a new product or drug, there are estimates widely quoted right now that it takes anywhere from $1 to $4 billion to go from here's a potential target to here's an FDA-approved drug. That is a big burden, and that, of course, then fuels some of the high prices that we currently see for many of the novel agents that come out. So, of course, looking at this, anybody would say there has to be a better way. And we had a session here at San Antonio really directed at seeing if we could begin to talk about a more efficient and leaner but equally effective and convincing clinical trials system.
I was struck when we are still stuck at that number of 3 to 5% of adults on clinical trials, where you have something like 70% of children on trials, and we've seen such great changes in survival for pediatric cancers. Why is there such a disparity?
I think there are multiple factors that relate to that disparity. The first is that pediatric oncology is a relatively small community, and there was a kind of an agreement early on that because the cancers are so rare and the trials so hard, therefore, to do, that these leading centers and physicians would collaborate. And it became almost an ethical imperative to put any kid with sarcoma, leukemia, lymphoma, glioblastoma, or neuroblastoma, all of those diseases, those kids went on clinical trials as a right. I think also for the scared parents who are their agents, and I'm just speculating, but it may be a little easier to understand the importance of the trials when the historical outcomes weren't so good and it's your baby that is at risk here. Now, in contrast, interestingly, many adults believe that their doctor already really knows what's best for them and wants that treatment, and they fear the clinical trial as somehow risky compared to the standard therapy. And I think we have a hard sell here because we have to help people to understand that while treatment is good and getting better all the time, we don't really put people at risk in the clinical trial system the way they think. There are tremendous protections. But the second is what I alluded to a little bit earlier. The truth is that access to trials is also restricted by their expense and how much burden they represent for practices. I mean, if I can see 5 patients or 1 for a clinical trial day in and day out, there's a real sacrifice to see the one.
Another question I have is, more than 80% of cancer patients are treated in the private sector, in the private practice setting. As an advocate, as a survivor, my fantasy would be that we could find ways to enhance collaboration between the private sector and the academic sector. I understand that for the private practice to implement clinical trials, it's paperwork intensive, they can't afford to do so, but the concern it raises for me are the numbers of patients in the community that could benefit from a clinical trial that don't have access.
I couldn't have asked for a better question, because the issue in terms of redefining the clinical trial system is to maybe get away from the black and white of on study, off study. And one way to do that would be to ask, is there anything that we could begin to learn from the patients who are not on conventional clinical trials? And they might provide more information about what we expect from various treatments in the community, and they might establish benchmarks against which we could measure novel therapeutics. So we are at the beginning of an era in medical oncology and medicine in general where we might be able to do that. And what I'm really referring to is leveraging the growing investment in medical records, electronic medical records, and informatics. Now, we have a problem at the outset, and the problem is we have failed to agree upon a uniform set of standards for how we warehouse our data. What I mean is we all buy medical record systems. It's a free market. They are competitive products. But regrettably, they don't actually adhere to the same behind-the-scenes standards. It's as if, as you drive across the state of Pennsylvania, in different towns, red lights, green lights, yellow lights mean very different things. Whether you drive left, right, or center varies, and you have to figure out as you go along. All different cars can operate on the road. All different vehicles can operate on the road, but there are rules of that road. The internet itself is somewhat like that. The rules of internet data transmission are standardized, but there are thousands to millions now of devices that interface with that, and they do it effectively. But we have unfortunately allowed this to unravel. So ASCO has organized a program called CancerLink. It's a rapid learning system. Rapid learning systems are computer systems that basically in real time take in data and begin to sift through that data, find patterns, learn from them, bring them to the attention of the overseers, i.e. us. And it's possible that as the community practices that you talk about increasingly have to convert to electronic records, that they will be willing to participate in this program. And that makes all of the patients something between clinical trials participants and not. They could be knowledge donors, data donors. And that would allow us to start to bridge that gap. By the way, it has the additional potential of allowing us to think about the concept of taking drugs not at phase 3 but at phase 2 into the community under controlled circumstances, seeing how people do, and getting hints so that when we have to do the phase 3, we have a more accurate prediction of what to expect. We can do a leaner, more efficient trial. That's really the crux of the session I was in yesterday.
Do you feel that if patients initiated discussions with their doctors, I'm interested in this trial, that more times than not, the academic center and the community-based doctor would find a way to work together to get a patient on a trial?
I think the short answer to your question is yes. But I could imagine, and in fact we envision for this rapid learning system for CancerLink, that patient walks into the doctor's office. As the doctor's office is, of course, putting data in, a little balloon pops up and says, this patient has an EGFR mutation. Did you know that there's a trial of a new inhibitor 80 miles away in Pittsburgh, in Albany, wherever? And the doc would then have a way of contacting that trial. Now, it might be under an ideal circumstance that the drug can be distributed out, or it might be that the patient does travel at that point. But either way, you're building collaboration so that the studies can get done more efficiently.
Now, but you also may have the patient who discovers that they have a particular mutation or a marker, does their own research, and comes back and says, hey, I found this trial.
Well, I think it's the same idea, but ultimately, what I want to see is that we find good drugs and get them into the broadest number of patients as efficiently as we can, and at the same time that we make sure that we identify those things that shouldn't move forward. And obviously, if we had 6% of adults on clinical trials instead of 3%, we'd have the potential to half the time to making these advances and so on. And so I'm optimistic that a combination of the human interactions that you're talking about, but also the uniform access to data and the rapid feedback that that access could bring might really be a transformative moment for us in terms of how we actually do clinical research.
Thank you so much, really. Dr. Cliff Hudis, Chief Breast Cancer Medicine Service at Memorial Sloan-Kettering Cancer Center, New York City.
Thank you, you too.